This program is made possible by the Atchafalaya Trace Commission and Heritage Area. Visit us online at www.atchafalaya.org, and in part by the Arts Council of Greater Baton Rouge and the Louisiana Division of the Arts.
I always liked wildlife, I always liked the outdoors, but I was used to mountains and clear water and streams like that, and I'd been out in the Rockies chasing bighorn sheep for about 2 years when one of my stock photo agents asked me if I had some pictures of bayou pigeon for a Time Life book called The Bayous. It was just about to come out, and he figured since I lived here, I would have it. Well, I never had been in the Atchafalaya except crossing it on Highway 190. So I called him and said I'd go out and shoot it, and he says, well, the deadline's tomorrow, so you don't even have time to get your film developed. Well, I decided to go anyway, so I drove around the entire Atchafalaya on the levee. It took me 3 days. And I said, wow, I got to get in the boat and get out there. So I got my canoe, started paddling around, and it was just like a wilderness paradise. And those are some of the most peaceful and memorable days in my life.
Hello, I'm Bill Rodman. It's been nearly 30 years since photographer and author CC Lockwood first stepped foot in Louisiana's Atchafalaya Swamp, America's largest swamp wilderness. His work introduced much of Louisiana and the world to the profound natural beauty and diversity and the mystery and intrigue of a dynamic natural wonder. And his present-day perspective is an interesting one.
The change in the nature here is changing faster than, say, the Grand Canyon or the Sonoran Desert. But, I could foresee those changes in nature better than I could in the people.
CC Lockwood was eyewitness to the last of an endangered Atchafalaya species that has since altogether vanished. From here, we explore how, ironically, the very forces of nature that first attracted people to live in the Atchafalaya wilderness ultimately forced out the great swamp's most unique inhabitants. And perhaps most importantly, what this change bodes for the Atchafalaya Swamp's future. Situated in south-central Louisiana, the lifeline of the 600,000-acre Atchafalaya Swamp is the Atchafalaya River, the second largest river in America in terms of water volume. The Atchafalaya, a main distributary or flood valve for the Mississippi River, empties into the Gulf of Mexico, accounting for 30% of the bigger river's annual flow. Levied in the 1930s for flood control by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Atchafalaya Swamp is essentially a wet and wild, 18-mile wide, 90-mile long emergency spillway for the lower Mississippi River. Since the creation of levees, the swamp's water level can rise and fall 8 to 10 feet in a typical year. A seasonal cycle responsible for cultivating 23 million pounds of crawfish, a Louisiana delicacy, annually, and one of the largest fish crops in the United States. These combined forces of nature and man contribute to making the Atchafalaya Swamp one of the most productive and rapidly changing natural environments in the world.
I basically spent about 8 years out here And I'd estimate about 100 days at least a year camped out in the swamp for that time.
While living in and photographing Louisiana's quintessential swamp, this native of Arkansas turned out a high-profile National Geographic article and a critically acclaimed book about the Atchafalaya, a name that stems from the Choctaw Indian word Atchafalaya, meaning long river.
I mean, it's a magical word, first of all. Everybody just wondered what was out here.
And from the beginning, his work began drawing attention in cities like Baton Rouge, Lockwood's home, just 18 miles away.
And I mean, they were afraid of swamps, and they started seeing this cute little raccoon and the egret with their breeding plumage. Wow, that's neat. You know, I've crossed that bridge, but God, it's beautiful.
Yet, outside Louisiana, most folks still have never heard of it. The Atchafalaya Basin, a 600,000-acre maze of hardwood swamps, backwater lakes, and winding bayous in the heart of Louisiana's Cajun country, remains a watery and Spanish moss-draped enigma that somehow has managed to elude national and international recognition. One contributing factor is that the Atchafalaya knows no roads. The only way in or out of the Great Swamp is by paddle, motor, or airboat.
All right.
You know, it's been a long time, but I think we got the feeling it's right over here.
Above all else, CC Lockwood was lured to the Atchafalaya by its wildlife. The swamp supports 50% of America's migratory waterfowl and is home to 200 species of birds.
Well, I spent 38 days in that blind in one night. That was a neat place.
From there, most memorably, CC Lockwood took pictures. But what Lockwood remembers most about his prized perch in this vast egret rookery is that it was all a lake.
And that's some of the biggest changes I've seen in the last 25 years is land that was once lakes is now forest. And of course, in the spring, it's pretty wet throughout the Atchafalaya. But in the fall, lakes that were once there in the fall are no longer there.
I don't know anybody that's full-time anymore.
55-year-old Calvin Voisin was a full-time swamper.
I just wanted to live out here a while, and I had the opportunity to do it. So.
The mainstays of his subsistent lifestyle were commercial fishing and trapping over a period of 6 years in the 1970s. Since then, like every young resident swamper of his time, Voisin was lured out of a full-time Atchafalaya existence by economic opportunities outside.
I was getting into working construction work, and it was too hard to work out here, and you just couldn't make any money year-round out here, you know.
A favorite ritual was a visit to the Atchafalaya home of fellow swamper Alcide Verrett, a man who knew or cared to know no other life.
Well, everybody just liked Seed, and he never met a stranger. And
Y'all come on up here, have a cup of coffee. You hungry?
stop here on a Sunday morning, it was like going to Piccadilly.
Eggs and bacon in the morning, pork roast, deer roast, afternoon, always something, and plenty. You couldn't pass here in daylight hours without somebody being up visiting. And it's kind of cleaned out now. We got a canopy over it. Last time I had to blaze through the briars. And you know, what I remember most about Alcide is just that energy, the love of people. He could go on and on, talking, making coffee, cooking for folks. And then it was time to work. He could work hard, and I knew him in his 70s. And he could go through that swamp with all his hunting, fishing paraphernalia a lot faster than I could go through with my cameras. This could be the last time I could walk in here. It'd be hard for somebody that's had any taste of civilization to come out here and change and do it like they used to. It's plain hard work. And I mean, you know, Alcide would make his own paddles. He'd make his own nets. Alcide lived a heck of a life, and it feels good to me to see it just as it was. I mean, his dishes are in there, everything. I mean, there might have been a little pilfering of an iron pot or something, but basically it's just like Alcide lived there. And it's neat to me to see it go back to nature.
When Alcide Verret died in 1998, he was 99 years old. Aside from his last several years spent with a brother in the city of Plaquemine, Louisiana, Verret was the last man to have been born, raised, and live his entire life in the Atchafalaya Swamp. No one was more familiar with or attuned to the natural ebb and flow, the giving and taking of the ever-transforming Atchafalaya Swamp. And the Atchafalaya Alcide Verret knew in the twilight of life would have seemed a million miles away from his turn of the 20th century youth.
Bayou Chene existed as a community for 100 years. It was a great frontier American story. It was unique.
Roughly 5 miles northwest of Verret's home was once the center of a bustling Atchafalaya Swamp community.
Bayou Chene was very isolated. I mean, there were no roads to it, certainly. All transportation into the community, out of the community, inside the community, all of that transportation was by boat.
Along these banks, the water-bound community of Bayou Chene, French for Oak Bayou, counted 3 churches, a freestanding Catholic and Methodist church, along with a floating Baptist church boat. According to accounts, there were 3 different grocery stores here at one time or another as well.
You can drive down Bayou Chene in your fiberglass boat with your powerful outboard motor and not have any idea that there was a community of 500 or 700 people living out here. It's only taken 50 years for the evidence of that community to vanish.
Ben Maygarden is a historian with EarthSearch Incorporated, a New Orleans-based cultural resources management company. One of his assignments included writing a book about Bayou Chene.
In this area was the geographic center of Bayou Chene. There was a cemetery on Bayou Jean-Louis. The Methodist cemetery was down the bayou a little bit, and the post office was here. School building was in this area. The old Bayou Cheners consistently told me how beautiful it was out there. Unbelievable riches of game, of fish, of timber, majestic swamps, natural levees just teeming with game. This was really one of the last places, certainly in our part of the United States, that led a sort of frontier existence.
To better understand the origins of Bayou Chene, one must understand the rich cultural legacy of the Atchafalaya Swamp. Early historical records show that the Atchafalaya was viewed, understandably, as a great obstacle.
The Native Americans, by the early 18th century, had established a system of moving through the swamp.
Carl Brasso is a professor of history at the University of Louisiana, Lafayette. According to one account, Brasso says the Chitimacha Indians established landings on either side of the swamp and maintained a ferry system made up of a set number of pirogues, or flat-bottomed canoe-type boats.
to ensure that transportation facilities were available for people who were brave enough or crazy enough, depending on your perspective, to make the trip across the basin.
The first customers of European descent, brave enough or crazy enough, were Acadian refugees, banished from Nova Scotia.
There's been an intimate relationship between the Acadians and the basin since the arrival of the first exiles in the mid-1760s.
Living on the fringes of the Great Swamp, the Acadians relied heavily upon the abundance of the Atchafalaya's natural resources to sustain themselves in the early years of settlement. But by the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, efforts to settle the vast interior of the swamp began. Prompted by a growing demand for agricultural land, pioneers, including poor Anglo-Americans, free people of color, and land speculators with slaves keen on establishing sugar plantations and mills, made up the first major wave of Atchafalaya settlements.
In 1841, records show at least 16 planters had homesteaded the Bayou Chene area. A census in 1850, the first to officially list residents at Bayou Chene, counted 184 free persons in 41 households.
Free people of color accounted for 30% of the free population, and 12 slave owners held a total of 93 slaves. In 1858, a post office was established, signifying the newly established settlement was big enough and stable enough to be officially recognized. And so began the Bayou Chene community. But troubling times were ahead. The Civil War and a disastrous flood in 1865 brought Bayou Chene to its knees. The sugar industry never recovered.
In the period after the Civil War, you have Bayou Chene with an entirely white population. They were not, for the most part, Acadians. They were largely Anglo-Americans.
Cypress logging had become the mainstay commercial industry, and by the early part of the 20th century, Bayou Chene got its first taste of the industrial age with the arrival of motor-powered boats.
It made fishing easier, it made moss collecting easier, and in this period, say from maybe 1907 to the 1927 flood, is what you could call the golden age of life at Bayou Chene and in the Atchafalaya Basin.
I still love it out here, just like home, you know, it's home to me still.
71-year-old Rule Seneca of Plaquemine, Louisiana, was one of Bayou Chene's last generation. And he still makes the 45-minute boat ride to a fishing camp he keeps on the Chene.
Oh, sometime, at least once a week, sometime twice. I'm just starting to clean it. Get out of here, honey. She's scared. She's not used to all these people.
Why is it you like coming out here, Mr. Rule?
Oh, it's just relaxing. You know, get away from the big city. And this is actually my home, you know. Born and raised out here.
But just 4 short years before Rule Seneca was born on a houseboat on Bayou Chene, the community was rocked by one of the most devastating natural disasters of the 20th century.
For a number of reasons, the 1927 flood was the beginning of the end for Bayou Chene.
From that time on, you know, it started going downhill.
The 27 flood was so destructive throughout the Mississippi Valley, the federal government began to take a much larger role in flood prevention. So began construction of levees around the Atchafalaya Swamp in the early 1930s.
But the creation of the floodway eventually led to the environmental deterioration of the basin. Every year, the basin would flood more and more severely. Larger and larger amounts of Mississippi River sediment would be deposited on the banks of waterways within the Atchafalaya Basin.
This transformation of the environment began to tear at the very fiber of life at Bayou Chene. Fishermen began to see a reduction in the size and number of fish.
Surprisingly enough, even though there were so many professional fishermen out there, people didn't eat a lot of fish. They relied heavily on their livestock and on foodstuffs that they could raise. Once you had that annual flood and that annual influx of sediment, it became virtually impossible to pursue any kind of farming out there.
To make matters worse, the timber industry had also gone into decline. Nearly every great old-growth cypress forest had been logged out. So began a mass exodus from Bayou Chene.
It was a hard decision, but they had no choice, you know. Everybody was leaving gradually, and they had to go sooner or later, you know.
And so by the early 1950s, the school was closed, the post office was closed, and really there were no more year-round permanent residents there. Bayou Chene had ceased to exist as a geographical community.
Today, 75 years after the Great Flood, there is but one visible remnant of the original Bayou Chene community.
This one here, my grandmother died in 1927.
A family gravestone the Senecas have managed year by year to keep above ground.
We've been trying to keep it up the best we can ever since, you know.
The rest of old Bayou Chene, including the last of its namesake live oak trees, lies shrouded beneath an estimated 12 to 15 feet of Atchafalaya River sediment. Its banks and its story now forever obscured by sandy soil-loving willow trees. While most resilient-natured Bayou Cheners quickly adapted to new lives in cities and towns outside the leveed Atchafalaya Swamp, a few, like Alcide Verrett, kindly refused. Myrtle and Harold Bigler found refuge 8 miles downstream on a high and dry Atchafalaya River bluff.
Myrtle simply said once, I wanted to live where there was a river.
Author and photographer Greg Gerard knew the Biglers for over 30 years.
Myrtle's favorite quotation to me was, some people think we're crazy to be living out here on the river by ourselves. I think the people that lived in town must be crazy. Her greatest fear, Myrtle's greatest fear, was that she would be forced to move to town to live with her nieces or whatever and have to leave this place.
When Harold died in 1990, Myrtle Bigler chose to live the last 5 years of her life without running water, without electricity, and alone.
You know, the fear of dying was no problem for her, but and unfortunately she died right here where she wanted to live and die.
It was 1995 when Myrtle Bigler left the Atchafalaya, beside the river she had always wanted to live by. She was 95 years old. She was also the last full-time resident of the Atchafalaya Swamp. And so ended a 200-year-old cultural legacy.
I'm Hazel Ashley Terrio, and I'm from Bayou Chene, Louisiana.
Or did it? The Bayou Chene birthright is still cause to celebrate at the annual Bayou Chene reunion in Morgan City, Louisiana. Here in the eyes of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the story of one of this country's last and most unique frontier communities lives on. The dynamic relationship between nature and man in the Atchafalaya Swamp continues to evolve. Commercial fishermen still work its productive waters. Year after year, more and more sportsmen and eco-tourists discover the bounty and beauty of America's largest swamp wilderness. The state of Louisiana has also enacted new legislation further protecting the wet and wild nature of the Atchafalaya Swamp. New programs now promote nature-based as well as cultural tourism in and around the Atchafalaya Basin.
That's the newest real estate in the United States.
In perhaps the strangest Atchafalaya paradox of all, The river sediment that destroyed a way of life on Bayou Chene is today responsible for producing one of the most productive river delta systems in the world.
The potential exists for Louisiana to gain a whole new parish in the Atchafalaya Bay area.
New coastal land along America's most threatened coastline, growing seaward at a rate of 100 feet per year.
Best way to save this place is just let it be, you know, just let this 18-mile wide strip of the Atchafalaya Basin, just let it be, whatever they have to do to keep it from ever being developed, you know, for flood control, for recreation, for wildlife habitat, for clean air, for clean water. It's very valuable to an overcrowding world to keep this as a wild space.